Today's sermon is titled, The Interactions Among Experiences of Trauma and Spirituality. Joseph Morrow went through 12 years of religious primary and secondary education. He received his doctorate of clinical psychology with concentrations in health psychology and forensic psychology from Loma Linda, a religious-based university that also includes a medical school. He has extensive training as a yoga psychotherapist and hypnotherapist. Dr. Morrow's personal background includes being sexually abused by his pediatrician. At the age of 11, he watched a schoolmate fall from the top of a Ferris wheel. While attending a Jesuit Christian college prep high school, he was being sexually harassed and fondled by a highly respected former Marine Christian brother. At the age of 31, his father told him he was always welcome in the family home, but to leave his lifestyle in California. Dr. Morrow is gay. At age 47, Dr. Morrow underwent open heart surgery to repair a congenital birth defect. A mechanical heart valve was implanted. Throughout the time of his recovery from the surgery, he never got his pain prescription filled. Long before that time, he had learned to withstand pain. Today, Dr. Morrow works as a clinical forensic psychology within a maximum security state hospital that provides care to adult males with severe mental illness, for example, schizophrenia, and histories of violent crimes. The small group of 13 patients with whom Dr. Morrow works have been deemed to be among the most dangerous in the state of California. The foundation of his approach to treating these patients is referred to as trauma-informed care. In short, rather than focusing on what is wrong with the patient, he asks the patient what happened to them. Dr. Morrow, welcome.
Thank you very much. First, thank you for allowing me to have a small slice of this incredibly beautiful day in Cambria and to listen to some thoughts that I would like to share. Also, I would like to let folks know here at Unity that the slides that I'm utilizing today, I am completely 100% okay with those being distributed to anyone who would like a copy. So however that might happen, please feel free to do it. One of the reasons why I encourage that is because the last slide includes some resources, some websites to resources that I hope will be helpful. And the last thing that I would like to say before actually starting the talk is that the reason why I think this topic is important, one of the reasons, is because for so many people who go through difficult situations in their life, their spirituality is the one thing that they have to hold on to. And when that one thing comes into question, the rug is pulled out from under them and they may feel as though they are left with nothing. So I think it is worth our time as individuals as well as community. I love the fact that your organization here is referred to as community. I won't go into the details of that, but it really warms my heart. So with that, I will go ahead and start. So my aims for the talk here first is hopefully to inspire each one of us to reflect on what different things mean for us regarding spirituality, regarding trauma, to increase the confusion for all of us, because that can inspire us to look within even deeper for clarity, and to make that whole process very messy, because that's really what trauma work is, and arguably what life is it's messy. There's a lot of protocols out there that we try to retrofit ourselves into, but the reality is that life is messy, and that's completely okay. So first, let me talk just a bit about what comes to mind for me when I use the word trauma, so that you kind of have a sense of where I'm coming from. First of all, trauma is something that happens without warning. Um, when it happens, our power is taken away from us. And it can come in many different forms. Just a few forms that I have here on the slide include environmental trauma, so earthquakes, fires, environmental change, accidental traumas, a plane crash, a train crash, car crash, medical trauma. This morning, as you all were sharing what's going on with people who you love in your life, you were speaking to medical trauma, and there's a whole nother talk on what's referred to as post-medical trauma, which has its own form of our responses to it. And then there's interpersonal trauma, which, as the name implies, is trauma that happens between individuals. What is a bit different about interpersonal trauma is that one of the hallmarks of it is that there are secrets. When there is an environmental trauma, everybody knows about it, and forces rally to come together to provide support, which is amazing. And that really, really decreases the incidence of PTSD from events like that. But when a person needs to hold what they have gone through within, as you can imagine, it festers. So interpersonal trauma is primarily what I focus on, but I did just want to mention that trauma takes many different forms. So continuing on this, what is meant by trauma? When a traumatic event happens, typically at that time, there isn't anyone to reach out to. And this is why pervasive loneliness throughout a person's life can be a result of trauma. It can severely affect our ability to trust the world, trust our government, trust our family, our friends, trust our body. So trust is one of the two things that I find that folks struggle with the most in this work. The other one is sleep, because when we sleep, we are at our most vulnerable. And the age of onset can be a significant factor in the effects of a traumatic event. Here's the good news. The more life we have experienced, the more we realize that we can be resilient to a great deal of adversity. With the pandemic that has happened, our young folks are the ones who have been struggling the most with the effects of that traumatic experience. Because they have not gone through what those of us who are older have gone through and overcome. So they don't really know the resilience just yet. Okay, so segueing now to spirituality. So, and this is where I start to increase the confusion and perhaps controversy, and all that is just fine. So, is spirituality something that we define for ourselves, or something that has been defined by others? And there's no judgment of either one. But I think it's important for us to keep in mind, because it can affect how that spirituality may come into play when we go through a traumatic experience. So is it individual or is it shared? Now, certainly, I think most of us would agree that our spirituality is a very individual experience that we have. But it can also include, as evidenced by this morning, coming together with others who have the same values and pursuits, etc. So it can also be a shared experience, which can also affect how one utilizes it, or perhaps is harmed by the experience of a trauma. And does it give us hope and expectations of good things that will happen. This can be what actually gets us through a trauma, but when our expectations are not met and bad things are happening, it can bring into question that which has been so important to us for so long, which is our spiritual being. So does it provide direction, which can be very comforting? Structure for someone who is going through a very unstructured experience in their life, a medical condition, dysfunction in the home. To have something that contains that all can be wonderful. But also to have our own journey of what spirituality means can be equally as important. And is it a form of attachment? So again, no judgment. When we attach to something, it is serving some purpose. But if that attachment, for example, an infant with a caregiver, brings with it a lot of uncertainty, fear, that attachment can start to become a hardship. And our spirituality can be an attachment. And does that bring with it comfort, or does that bring with it hardship? Another question for us to keep in mind. So when might trauma and spirituality collide? When spirituality means no anger or sadness. I have worked with many folks who try for decades, for example, to forgive a perpetrator of some trauma. And what I will sometimes share that is a bit controversial is that some things are unforgivable. And I think honoring one's emotional response to trauma is as equally as important as trying to frame it in a more positive way. When spiritual beliefs can contribute to that things. Oh, sorry, my little words blocked out on that monitor. When spiritual beliefs contribute to shame. Now, oftentimes guilt and shame are thought of as one and the same, but they're very different. When we feel guilt, that usually motivates us to try to repair, maybe repair something in ourselves, repair a relationship, repair a society, whatever it is. When we experience shame, we withdraw. We try to hide. We try to become smaller. So when spiritual beliefs bring with it an interpretation for that individual as shame, it can go into isolation and loneliness. When one feels betrayed or abandoned by their spirituality or its community, which I spoke to a bit in the beginning. When my trauma, I forget what that word is on the top there. Okay, so when might trauma become a problem, basically? More on this. When the trauma or the spirituality starts to make the person feel like damaged goods, which is a phrase that I hear a lot in a person's description of themselves. When the person begins to blame themselves for what has happened. And this is a very human response to a traumatic experience, because as I said in the beginning when I was defining trauma is about one's power being taken away. So an instinctual way to try to recover from a traumatic experience is for us to take our power back, which is healthy, except when that wide net that is cast starts to have the person taking responsibility for things that are not their responsibility, like a parent's alcoholism, for example, or the list goes on and on. So we have to be careful that the person isn't starting to blame themselves. When it starts to contribute to confusion and distraction and feeling lost. When a person goes through a traumatic experience, their brain, and I could spend 4 hours talking about the neurobiology and physiology of trauma, the threat detection center in their brain starts going at 200 miles an hour, 360 degrees, looking for any more threats in their environment. And that can make it very difficult to read a book. When the pandemic first began, I talked to so many folks who are avid readers, and that has really been their go-to for peace. And they said, I cannot get through one page. And I said, the reason why that is because your brain is trying to protect you from some invisible virus that is going around. So it's very frightened to let you just focus on a book in front of you. Distrust of self and others skyrockets. So this distrust of self is equally as important as distrust of others, because a person just doesn't know what their truth is anymore. There can be a foreshortened sense of the future. When I work with young folks who have been through a lot of trauma in their life, and I ask the question, what are some of your goals for the future? It's not uncommon for me to hear them say, and I'm talking about folks in their 20s, for them to say, I've never really thought about my future because I never expected to live this long. So just helping a person start to accept the possibility of a future is something that is important in this work. And these collisions, these feelings of hopelessness can contribute to risky and dangerous behaviors. Substance use is a way of coping that more than 85% of people who go through trauma reach for. But risky, potentially dangerous behaviors go way beyond that. Again, because folks can feel like, what's the point? Why should I really be playing it safe or planning for my future? So on a brighter note, when does spirituality help with recovering and healing from trauma? When self-compassion begins. My experience has been that folks who have gone through traumatic experiences are really, really good at having compassion for others. I'm so grateful for them. But when it comes to having compassion for themselves, it's very much a swim upstream. So when this compassion for self begins, and when we can help support them in that, things start to get better. When connection with self and others begins, again, with interpersonal trauma and shame, there can be that withdrawal. So coming together as community is really, really healing, part of the recovery process. When self-worth is increased, and again, that can be a journey upstream, because the person has all sorts of reasons for themselves that they have no value, or the value that has been placed on them has been incredibly damaging. Most probably clearest in incidents of childhood sexual abuse, where that person grows up thinking that their value is in the satisfaction and pleasure they can give to someone else. So starting to realize that they have value because they are a human being on this planet is something that can take a lot of work, but is so important. And as I've referenced earlier, when future-oriented thinking starts to happen, and it can start with today. What is something that you can do today that will bring some peace and joy into your life? And then we build from there. How might spirituality facilitate recovery and healing from trauma? Observing humanistic behaviors in others. So the work that I do, I let people know this is not rocket science. What I do is I show respect. I show that I respect them, I value them, I'm going to listen to them, and I'm going to see them. And when you're part of a community like this, and you're doing scholarships, and you're doing all these things, and someone comes into this sacred space and sees that, that can start to instill hope again in the humanity of the people who are on this planet along with them. Teaching of internal coping strategies. And the reason why I have the word internal underlined is because trauma is a response to things that are happening around the person and to the person. And there might not be a lot of time left over to actually go within and see what can I do inside myself to help in this recovery of healing process. So things like mindfulness and meditation are important. Realizing one is not alone and forming new attachments. Again, I have a great deal of respect for people who have been through trauma who are actually willing to do that. And finally, transitioning from reliving traumas where the physical body is actually having a response to that car that just backfired because they were involved in some kind of gun violence themselves. So a transition from reliving physically and emotionally experiences to those becoming memories of what has happened to them in the past. And these are what are referred to as the principles of trauma-informed care. First and foremost, there needs to be safety. That is the foundational element. There needs to be the ability to trust. And this is why I am very transparent, for example, with the bio, because that is a key principle of trauma-informed care, is to be transparent so a person knows who they're interacting with and they can make the decision of whether or not they want to trust. Support from peers. So when I do a trauma group, what I normally do is I get it started and then I go off to the side and sit on a table and let the members of the group facilitate their group. Because no one, they aren't going to be able to relate to anyone better than someone who has been through what they've been through. Collaborate, coming together, forming healthy attachments, as I've been mentioning several times. Empowering a person to have a voice. And again, the neurobiology that happens with trauma, it takes the form of making a person as silent as possible. Some people go through trauma, won't speak again for a long period of time. They won't be able to feel themselves breathing. So just working to bring their voice back is part of the recovery process. And recognizing all these individual and cultural, historical, gender issues that come along with folks who have been through trauma, because it manifests differently for everyone. I am 1 minute over, but here are the resources, and thank you for your time.